Susan. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, she's unmuted.
Oh, you are unmuted.
Oh, okay. Well, it's always great to introduce someone who does not need any introduction. And I think that Greg fits the bill, but because some people here are going to be beginners, I'll just mention that he's been a very active member of the Maine Mycological Association, which was one of the first clubs to join our consortium, that he and that club's president, Michaeline Mulvey, have been doing, offering week-long courses in mushroom identification at Eagle Hill in Maine, that Greg has written books and given talks, not only on identification, but also on poisonings and on medicinal uses of mushrooms. So without further ado, here is one of the best people we could find to teach you how to identify the first mushrooms.
Thank you very much, Susan and Tom, for hosting this. I'm always happy and a little bit odd, AWED, not ODD, to be in such a august company. So very happy to be here. And, you know, we are offering this because the Maine Association and many others around the country are reaping the rewards and the challenge of an influx of very new and fresh mushroom enthusiasts. And, you know, we did a survey of the Maine Mycological membership last fall, thanks very much to our dear friend Aaron Witham. And we heard a lot saying we need beginner level presentations. We need 101. And so we're going to be doing a series of those. And this fit well into that. When Susan presented the idea, I said, sure, I've got most of that prepared already. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. I want folks to recognize that most of our the photographs here are going to be Maine mushrooms, with a few exceptions that will usually be noted. And just to let you know, if anytime you, wait a minute, something happened here. I'm going to have to try this again, so hold on. So most of the mushrooms there, can you see everything? Are we working? Okay, perfect. Most of the mushrooms are ones we should recognize. And this is mostly geared...
Okay, sorry to interrupt. It's showing in like the next slide view. So we see the current slide.
All right. Well, let me do this again. And we will... No, I appreciate that feedback because that allows me to stop. We'll do that. How's that?
Now we can't see your thing. I think you stopped sharing. Yeah. Perfect.
All right, there we go. So most of these are northeastern mushrooms because the majority of the group is from there. And I've added in some material from further away, and you'll see it as it comes up. And just to acknowledge, let us see here, that, you know, going back to John Muir, for me, mushrooms, since the time I was a teenager, you know, getting out into nature, getting out into the wild has been a place of solace and mental wellness for me, and it still is that. So to track John Muir, you know, and into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul. And that's always been a strong portion of the mushrooming for me. And of course, I have to start out with the morels. because we are just hopefully coming into that season here in Maine. And I feel like we need to start still with the understanding that America has been a mycophobic culture. That my father was Irish and had, we wouldn't allow any mushrooms into the house. My mother, who was German and French, would sneak some in, but never anything wild. And those cultural attitudes really passed through the generations for quite a while. And that is what we've known as mycophobia, that fear of mushrooming. And boy, these days it is changing so rapidly. It's been on a progression of change for a couple of decades, but has that sped up? And I want to show this, this artwork by Beatrix Cromwell, which is just lovely. She has a couple of these posters of mushrooms, toadstools, whatever you want to call them. Just fun. So what challenges us all at the beginning is when we want our mushrooming to be guided by our stomachs. So it's fun, it's beautiful, it's wondrous until we think about, can I eat that? And it always scares me when someone starts out with that question, oh, is it edible? Before even learning what it is. So Maine, as an example, has at least 2,000 different species of mushrooms. And every year we discover more that have never been seen in Maine, even if they've been named someplace else. And then, of course, those people of a PhD ilk who are making their name by splitting and reorganizing our taxonomy always add some more to the mix. And in general, and these are really kind of gross estimates, about 10% are known and accepted edibles. And here, maybe 30, 40 species are commonly and widely eaten. And I'm noticing people keep pushing that number, so it's growing. About 10% of them are known or suspected as toxic, and a few dangerously or potentially deadly. For about 20 years, I've been a volunteer consultant with the poison centers up here in northern New England. And I know that we're seeing an increase in calls from people making beginner's mistakes where their enthusiasm is overwhelming their knowledge base, and they make dangerous choices. So most of the others we have are too small, they're too tough, they're not well enough known, or their edibility is never established. And there's where we go. So where does one start? And what I'm going to go back to is 1943. And a little book on common edible mushrooms by a mycologist, Clyde Christensen, who's from the Midwest. And it was his thing. He said, there are so many good edible mushrooms that are widely available in our forests, in our fields. He's encouraging people to eat them. And he did that early branding thing. He said, I'm going to come up with the foolproof 4 mushrooms that are common. They're easily identified with without real easy toxic lookalikes, and with a well-established history of edibility. And he had this little chapter in the book called the Foolproof 4. And I got to say, I put this photograph of the bicolor boletes up there because A, it's a beautiful photograph, and B, it's one of my favorite edibles, though it's not one of the foolproof ones, but I stuck it in there anyway because I like it. So the original Foolproof 4 back in the 40s were morels, and for Dr. Christensen, they were all morels, all that are in the genus Morchella. And the sulfur shelp, we call it usually the chicken of the woods these days, Ladioporus sulphureus. The puffballs, and back then he said, any puffball, if you cut it open, it's firm and pure white on the inside. Yeah, go for it. And we can nuance that somewhat. And then the shaggy mane, the Coprinus comatus. Now, morels, if you look at the literature on toxicology, it causes a number of sickenings every year across this country. It's also the most commonly eaten collected wild mushroom in the country. And the sulfur shelf, the same way. Eaten raw, it's really, it's a nasty gastrointestinal distress, and it causes problems in maybe up to 5% of people who eat it anyway. So are those good foolproof? I don't know. We'll talk about that. So he came up with that foolproof 4, and 15 years ago, I said, well, what about a foolproof 4 of the Northeast? And I quickly threw out the idea of 4 because there were so many different mushrooms that fit those criteria. So, I got curious and said, well, is it going to be a nifty 9, a sumptuous 7? And so what I came down to, if you're new at this, new at collecting, new at integrating mushrooms into your food chain, start out with a few species. A few species that in your area are common. They're distinctive. There's no real toxic lookalikes that are common, and that they're yummy. And that's what I suggest. And these are the ones I came up for the Northeast. And we'll go through them individually. And, I have some questions. The lobster mushroom I'm only going to touch on because I question its validity as a foolproof mushroom. But we'll talk to the rest of those. And I put in the little white-lipped snail, Neohelix albularis, because he is one of the critters that we are competing for mushrooms in the woods for, or at least around here. The largest land snail in the North America. Native, not introduced. So let's go through some of these. And I have to start out with the golden chanterelles, which we used to always lump into Cantharellus sabarius, that European species. And now we're in the process of really distinguishing what species we have across the Northeast. And based on a couple of surveys I did about 10 years apart, it still remains the most commonly collected and eaten wild mushroom, certainly in the northern part of New England, and maybe all of New England. It's pretty common in moist forests, in the leaf duff growing mycorrhizally with several species of trees. And it's a generalist, either that or as we determine the actual speciation, there's a number of closely related species that grow with different trees. Here I find them really frequently with fir, with spruce, hemlock, birch, some places oak, and a couple of subspecies in oak. And here they follow the rainfall patterns. Anywhere I begin to see them in July, I expect to see them by mid-July if there's rain, peaking in mid to late August, and depending on the patterns of rain, maybe even considerably occurring into September and October. Singly or in troops across the forest. And, we always have to be aware of one which is not a lookalike, I'll touch on, the toxic jack-o'-lantern mushroom, because it causes, several incidents of multiple people getting sickened in this part of the world every year. And I'll touch on that in a minute. So golden, yellow, almost mustard yellow, but not orange at all. The similar color from the cap, the hymenium layer, the stalk, typically growing in troops of multiple ages, so they're not all mature. And this is a mushroom that begins to mature slowly over time. A study on the West Coast showed an average lifespan of a fruiting body of something between 30 and 60 days, and some of them living as long as 90 days in ideal weather patterns. And in further south, there's some other species. These are some photographs of the cinnabar red chanterelle taken by my summer daughter, Elizabeth Lilly, down in Florida. And we see that occasionally up in northern New England, but not particularly commonly. But it's beautiful, as you can see from E. Lily's photograph. She might be on tonight with us. And this one, this is the Canadians call this Cantharellus cinnabarinus variety pallidifolius, and it's a large mushroom. It's almost kind of like those West Coast, either Californicus or Formosa. That's my hand in there. And I find this under oaks or mixed forests of oak and beech. It's lovely. And of course, with chanterelles, there are several related species, smaller, usually in the Cantharellus group, that are also frequently eaten. So Craterellus agnicolor, the yellowfoot chanterelle, Craterellus tubiformis, sometimes the trumpet chanterelle or winter chanterelle. Usually it's later. Now, I got to tell you, this top right photograph, I am wondering about. We find this when Michaeline and I are up in Washington County, northeastern Maine, fruiting in August. I'm wondering if it might be something a little different, but there we go. This is the closest we've got. And the lower right photo, how often have you found the white form, pale white, bone white chanterelles? Sometimes fruiting in a large mixed cluster with the golden ones. I used to say, oh, it's got to be something different, but I think it's just a chance mutation. I even tried eating it once, but seemed to taste as fine as well. So for cooking tips on this and preservation, and this is a moving target, I think it's got a lovely odor of apricots, a little fruity, a lovely mild flavor. And what you cook it with, I think you have some responsibility not to overwhelm the flavor. Does well with butter, with mild oils. If it's heavy and waterlogged, I always start with a dry saute and then add the oil. Does well in cream sauces with fish or chicken. I love it on a white fish, or simply with eggs. And for me, if I'm going to preserve this, I don't dry it unless I want to powder it, but I saute and freeze. Each one of us have our own ways of doing that. And this photograph here, I was out on the West Coast in January and found some late fruiting Cantharellus californicus. And the knife I had to borrow because, of course, it didn't get onto the plane with me. There's a couple things we need to be aware of. Here's two lookalikes. This is a golden chanterelle on the left with Hygrophilopsis or Antiochus or a couple other species. And for some people, the false chanterelle is edible, and some it causes some distress. But so that's a common mistake occasionally. And on the right hand, the upper and lower are both Turbinellus, the scaly vase chanterelle. Again, it used to be placed in the same family, and now we know it's not, but there's a lot of look-alike. And again, well cooked, some people eat this just fine, but it causes a lot of gastrointestinal problems. And the next one, of course, always causes problems, always. This is the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, Omphallotus illudens, and it grows in a tight, dense cluster, cespitose, from the same place on the ground, or around a hardwood tree, or from buried hardwood. In my area, typically oak. And it's bright, bright orange. It's got true gills, not the blunted gills that don't fork. And if you find it young and fresh, it glows in the dark, hence the jack-o'-lantern name. And some people say that's a myth, but I have seen it. It's beautiful. And if you eat it, boy, you get really sick, usually for 5 to 7 hours. So if someone calls you and says, oh, I found this great big cluster of chanterelles all growing together, you say, don't eat them. And we handle calls regarding this mushroom every season. So the next species, which is the second most popular in Maine and the Northeast, based on those surveys, is the black trumpet. And those people who find it and eat it, they often rate it number one because it's just yummy. Related to the chanterelle, that same general vase shape, thin flesh. I find it most commonly in mixed hardwoods with oak, but also when a little bit lower down where it's moist enough to support hemlock with those oaks, it really likes that. And your first ones, particularly if they're fruiting through the leaf duff, can be a challenge to spot. But if you find them, you settle down and you look in concentric circles. 3 years ago, my son and I, he was ready to go out foraging again, and we went into an area, and he found the first cluster of black trumpets, and we went and kind of circled around that area, and about 75 yards away, we walked into the mother lode, just pounds and pounds. So this is growing mycorrhizal with those trees, usually oaks, and it'll be pretty loyal, only depending on abundant rainfall. Unlike the loyalty of the chanterelles, black trumpets will have good years followed by bad years. It's almost feast or famine. And depending on the year, I have found these in Maine in late June, and typically reaching a peak again mid to late summer, but I have found them, and others have found them here in Maine well into November, depending on those rainfalls. Now, I've had a couple of friends who love black trumpets, and in a good year, you can find pounds and pounds of them. And one of them emailed me in distress. She said, you know, I'm having this uncontrolled diarrhea that's just won't go away for days and days. And she had acknowledged that she had black trumpets breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a lot of them for several days, and it just overwhelmed her system. So beware of gluttony. But do not beware of these mushrooms. Find them and enjoy them. And if you find an abundance, dry them for future use. They're very distinctive. There's a couple of other species of Craterellus. Here, they're very uncommon, also edible. And if you find a big bowl or a basket of them, you're just loving it. They also have a rich smell. I think it's a little bit like shaved chocolate. This is one of those mushrooms you can almost find by smelling them, like the stinkhorns we were talking about earlier. And for cooking and preservation, this has got such a robust flavor. It lends itself to everything. You know, I've even put it between slices of cheese and slowly made a grilled cheese sandwich, grilling them slowly. I put them on flatbreads. I dry them and make risottos. They go with almost everything, so long as you don't mind that robust flavor. Light cooking will do well, and they dehydrate very, very readily. On a good year, I dry as many as I can. So my third one, which again is incredibly common across this country, and I'm going to talk about 3 species that are up in the Northeast, is the oyster mushrooms. Pleurotus austratus, the classic oyster mushroom of late fall, Pleurotus populinus, which used to be lumped in, the aspen oyster, and Pleurotus pulmonarius, for lack of a better term, I call it the summer oyster. So here we find it, you know, right about now, but a little bit later in Maine on aspen, and then on several hardwoods in the midsummer through late fall. And this sucker is a very aggressive saprobe. It's easily cultivated because of that. And this is one, the photograph here is the October one, austratus, and I like them when they're about this stage. There are still a little bit enrolled margins of the cap before they fully open. And the ones that fruit earlier in the season, you really have to beware and get ahead of the bugs. So this left-hand photograph, it's great because the man who owns this house ran into me later and said, you know, Greg, we had all these oyster mushrooms. And this was in October, you know, after a really heavy period of rain, and they were just a little too mature, a little too waterlogged. So I didn't collect any. I just took photographs that day for the ones on the left. But on the right, you know, both pulmonarius or Pleurotus austratus on the top and pulmonarius below, you know, just in perfect shape for use. Very distinctive, growing on wood, and rarely, you know, difficult to identify. Now, we are finding an invasive, not yet in Maine, certainly in Massachusetts and further south into New England. And this is one of the golden oysters, Pleurotus citrinopiliatus. They call it the yellow oyster, and it's escaping from cultivation into our woods. These are from a master's thesis by Andy Bruce from a few years ago. Very distinctive and very, very aggressive. I expect to find this in Maine anytime. And I suspect you're seeing it in your area. And you might appreciate it because apparently it's a nice edible as well, but very aggressive in our woods. So for cooking these guys, they're a little bit tough, particularly as the gills blend into the stem, and they appreciate a pretty low extended cooking time. Some people like to dip them and make a tempura, but they're pretty versatile in terms of their taste and their use. And medicinally, this one is really valued. It's got the glucans, which tend to stimulate immunity, as well as some compounds which are related to the mevinolins, closely related in structure to statins. And they really help in lipid balance and reduce cholesterol. I'm not a doctor. I'm not suggesting you get rid of your statins, but if you struggle with high cholesterol, eat more oyster mushrooms. And if you can't find them wild, they are so easy to cultivate, indoors or out. All right, welcome to spring, huh? Most of you here have already gone through your morel season. In Maine, it's just upon us and we need a little more rain. And you know, we have had a long debate. How many species of morels do we have? And I think most prudent people these days are saying, well, we've got the Morchella esculenta group and the Morchella elata group. And let's not bother going deeper. In terms of use, I think that's well. In our area, we find them under older apple trees, particularly upland, rather than in a really wet sites. Around recently dead elms, and in some forests, if you've got richer soil that's a little sweeter, because the key piece across much of northern New England is you have to look for sweeter soil, either from glacial till or from limestone bedrock. And as we mentioned early on, as we started tonight, there are some that tend to fruit heavily, almost saprobically, in wood mulch. This is a mushroom species where there's a debate to what extent is it mycorrhizal and to what extent is it saprobic. And from the folks who collect them after forest fires, it's that belief that they're growing mycorrhizally with the trees, and when they're killed by fire, they switch to rapid saprobic growth to rot the roots. And so here, Mother's Day to Father's Day, further south for beginning as early as late February, early March in Georgia and from there. And in the west, the fire morels, they find those at higher elevations in the middle of summer. And what we want is to be careful around distinguishing this from the false morel. So here are some true morels, Morchella esculenta group on the right-hand or left-hand side of this photograph, and a Gyromitra esculenta on the right, found in obviously the same area, the same day. But these morels mostly conical cap with those deep pits. And if you cut it down longitudinally, it's a completely hollow stem. And that plasticity of phenotype means sometimes those really conic become more rounded. As a caveat, just be aware that this mushroom is toxic if it's eaten raw or undercooked. So you cook them well. So as I said, we look in Maine to have morels by Mother's Day. This year, it's been too cool as it has for the past couple of years, but hope springs eternal. So a rich, rich flavor. Again, this is the most widely collected and eaten wild mushroom across the country. And I have learned over time, because I have some hidden spots where it grows, that when I find it and it's an inch long or 2 inches long, I leave it and come back 10 days later, sometimes 2 weeks later when it's mature and it's much more robust flavor. So slow saute or braising, there's like the black trumpets, its robust flavor lends itself to many uses. And if you've got extras, dry them or freeze them. I dry as many as I can and never seem like I have enough. Someone asked me, why did you put the $20 bill there? I says, because it's such a well-treasured mushroom. So the ones on the left-hand side there were found around in apple orchards. The ones in the top right were in sandy kind of bottomland around recently dead elms. And the ones on the bottom right were around dead elm trees and a few around white ash, all from the same site. And here's that plasticity of form. You know, on the same piece of property, you know, some of them really that dark gray when they come up until they get fully mature, and some of them the typical blonde. And in this part of the world, we find them about the same time that the lily of the valleys are opening, and the quince are opening, and the crab apples and the apple blossoms. So take those as your cue. And always we have to be aware, and people are pushing the edges around some of the Gyromitra. But the Gyromitra esculenta, the true false morel, is much more common in Maine than is the true morels. And they contain a toxin that gets converted in our guts to monomethylhydrazine. It can be quite toxic, and you can prepare them safely if you're thoughtful about it. But more, you know, we've been now carefully distinguishing the esculenta from some of the other species that are edible, the Corfii, the Brunea, the Carolina. So be aware of what you've got and what you're eating. In this photograph, on the left is the classic, you know, the false morel esculenta. And up top, you can see if you cut it down longitudinally, it has areas where it's hollow and areas where it's stuffed. And the bottom photograph is the true false morel esculenta on the left, Corfii in the middle, and Morchella esculenta, the group on the right-hand side. And all those were found growing within a mile of each other. So we're going to switch seasons from the spring to the fall. Shaggy manes, this was one of Clyde Christensen's Foolproof 4, which I deeply agree with. And this is a mushroom, this is probably the third wild mushroom I ever ate. It was fruiting heavily in the late fall on the University of New Mexico campus when I was there, around one tree that had been removed from the buried wood. And so it likes that disturbed ground from buried wood or things that have been organic matter that's been covered over. So it's a saprobe on those situations. And so when it grows somewhere, when you see it fruiting, it's going to be there until it exhausts that food source, and then you'll have to look for a new place. Here, I look for it about the time of the first frost. Occasionally, and it's really not very common, I'll find it in late spring in the same situations. And I found I was out in New Mexico in late August, and it was fruiting up into the higher elevations, 8,000–9,000 feet in the mountains there. So earlier in higher elevations. Now, there's other Inca caps that resemble this. And so you need to be clear, but it's a very distinctive mushroom. That bullet shape coming out of the ground, and as it ages, it will show a longer stem as it elevates it up, and as it matures, it starts to deliquesce. It breaks down its cap into an inky mess, hence the name. And Tom, I want to point out that these bottom ones on the right-hand side here was a photograph from North Haven Island last October.
That's great.
Yeah. And this was from the same. And here we have the full range from the little buttons on the left-hand side, and you can see about 2/3 of the way down, it's starting to darken up, and then it kind of melts away. I typically, unless I'm not finding many of them, when it starts to Incanize, as I call it, I let them be. But some people get really bold and even make a squid ink type pasta with the inky ones. It's a yummy mushroom. A little lovely mild flavor, really good for just a simple saute with butter. It's lovely in a cream soup or a vichyssoise, potato leek soup with these mushrooms are quite nice. Now, There are some sources that'll say, don't drink alcohol. Just like they mistake it for like the alcohol inky, atramentarius. But I have not seen ever cases where that's been confirmed. So I think that's one of those old wives' tales or something, scared wives' tales. Next mushroom, back to midsummer into the early fall, is the hedgehog mushrooms, the sweet tooth, Hydnum repandum, Hydnum umbilicatum. There's a couple of others. And for the repandum, we find it in mixed hardwood forests, sometimes with some conifers mixed in, anywhere from midsummer on. And the umbilicatum, the smaller one, typically here with hemlocks in the mid to late autumn. So it's a mycorrhizal species with trees in those clear tooth like hymeneum under the cap. And as we're getting more nuance with this, we're recognizing a whole lot more species. This is the classic, both left and top right, Hydnum repandum. And though I sometimes find a white form, this kind of all pinky peach color is pretty typical. And bottom right is the umbilicatum, and an even closer photograph of those small umbilicatum in a mixed pine and hemlock forest. It's a lovely, tasty mushroom. I like the texture. This is a mushroom, if you cook it, it stays a little crunchy. Nice flavor. I use it in a variety of things, but I like it, the texture lends itself really well to the softness of chanterelles and the crunchiness, and the flavors blend together well. Sometimes, the Hydnum repandum can get quite large in an ideal environment. I've seen them 7 inches in diameter, and as it gets more mature, it can tend to get bitter. So be aware of that. All right, so we've gone from gill mushrooms to tooth mushrooms, and let's talk about a polypore. Hen of the woods, the Japanese call it maitake. Those folks in the Midwest call it the sheep's head. Grifola frondosa covers it pretty broadly, separating it from Grifola umbellata, which is now Polyporus umbellata. See, yeah, there we go. Anyway, this is a saprobe, and it grows on the ground, unless it's on well-rotted wood, around the base of a over-mature or recently dead tree, deciduous. In our part of the world, it's almost exclusively on oak, but occasionally I find it off of ash or beech. And so if I'm looking for it, I'm looking for those over-mature, large trees, because it's a butt rotter. Butt meaning it's rotting the hardwood of the major roots and the lower end of the trunk. And if you find one of these, note the tree and the location. The first one of these I ever found was, I can't remember now, 1982 or 1983. And that tree is still giving off the occasional fruiting body of Grifola frondosa. It's essentially hollow. It also has ladioporus growing off of it, but it's been very loyal. So as a lookalike, the blackening polypore, Mirapilus stumcicia, I can't remember that one, is a lookalike, particularly when it's young. Some people say that Berkeley's polypore, Bonwarzia, is a lookalike. I don't think so. It's also, when it's young, quite a nice edible. So here we are, typical habitat growing around the base of a very large oak tree. And you can see there's at least 3 clusters around that left one. The right photographs lower, those were 5 clusters of about 8 or 9 around this large oak tree 2 years ago. And here's a close-up. And you're going to notice the last photograph, the cap color was true gray. This is kind of tannish gray. And you get these overlapping spatulate, spoon-like divisions with a pure white pore surface underneath. Here's the pore surface in the bottom lower. And you can see that top left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 clusters just on this side of that oak tree. And they're just kind of pressed almost up to the trunk typically. The ones on the bottom right, those are just young and emerging, unless you're afraid of your competition finding them. It'd be great to leave those for 3 or 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, depending on the weather, to let them mature a little bit before you collect them. And oops, let's see. Here we go. So we had tan, we had pure gray, and this one you'll notice it's quite dark gray. And what I've learned over time is the more sunlight this is fruiting in, the darker the cap color. It's a melanin reaction. And so this particular one on the right-hand side was fruiting in an open area. They had cut down the oak tree. So it was an open lawn area in the full sun. So it was very dark. I found them fruiting underneath a piece of birch bark, and they were almost pure white. So with the flavor on this, it's lovely, not too, overwhelming flavor, but it's pleasant. It's a firm texture, best used when it's slightly under mature. And I think, some people say cut off part of it. It's hard. I typically take the whole thing. And if you collect this large, 10-inch, 12-inch, 2-foot long diameter fruiting body, you're going to have to pull it apart and see what else is living inside it. Almost always there's sow bugs and millipedes. I have found several salamanders in them, one red-bellied snake. So be aware of what you're taking home. And cooking, it's incredibly versatile. My favorite first meal of the maitake season is to chop it up, saute it with some olive oil and some garlic, add a little tamari, and just simply have it over rice. It's lovely. And I often saute and freeze a lot of this. You can dry it, and particularly for medicinal use, you can dry it, but it becomes quite leathery, and you best powder it after that. Medicinally, it has a variety of highly branched beta glucans, so a good immune stimulator. It's been studied in some early phase 1 and 2 trials for use potentially as cancer. I think they've decided they couldn't make money, and so they stopped them. It also, they found in the phase 1 trials that it somewhat lowers your blood glucose. And so they're looking at, is this possibly something we can use for diabetes? But I'm not sure where they'll go with that. All right. Another tooth mushroom, another fall mushroom. And these are the lion's mane or comb tooth or bear's tooth or bear's head hidden them, depending on where you are and how you learned it. 3 species. And if you're on the far west coast, we want to throw in one more. We've got Hericium americanum, Hericium coralloides, further south, Hericium arenaceus, and in the west, on conifer, Hericium abiitum. Common in our area, typically growing in the fall, but also occasionally in the late spring and higher elevations. Most common on beech, secondarily birch or maple, other trees in other areas, even oaks. And I found it occasionally on oak. So it's a saprobe on deadwood or the heartwood of weakened trees. And it never fruits on the ground. And if you're worried, there's some people say, is this it? For some types of corals, the teeth always tend to flow down as it begins to mature. Always growing on wood. Beautiful. When it's young, it can come out slightly pinkish, almost coral colored, and then it becomes pure white. The bottom right-hand photograph, the 2 outside are getting, they've been rained on a couple times. They're a little over mature. They tend to yellow. I left those on the trunk. And this is a mushroom, particularly many people who are vegan or strict vegetarian use this as a substitute for seafood. It's a lovely, pleasant odor when you collect it when it's young and firm. Saute as a start. Some people make crab cakes with it, crab cakes. It also, if I'm using it medicinally, and I make a tincture of this regularly, I typically saute or dry it first. And for preservation for edibility, I saute typically and freeze. So medicinally, there's a couple of components that this is known for. It contains, again, those long chain beta glucans that tend to stimulate our immune system. And there's been I've never seen a clinical studies in people with this, but mostly in animal. But the secondary part is the one that's gotten all the press recently, particularly over the past 10 years. And that is its ability to stimulate the production of nerve growth factor. And so it's being looked at not only for nerve regeneration and after injury, but also to improve cognition. And there have been some clinical trials with people with mild to moderate dementia, just using the dried fruiting bodies. And it's been fairly effective. So that's where all the buzz is around this mushroom. A whole group we still haven't seen moving along, the puffballs. Remember, Clyde Christensen said all puffballs that have white. I'm going to narrow that down a little bit. These are saprobes typically growing. There's the larger ones in open grassy areas. The smaller ones are woodland typically. There's a range of species anywhere from, I find them sometimes in June here, but typically in mid to late summer through the mid-fall. And we'll talk about the caveat here. Here's my son carrying one where they have been fruiting for 30 years periodically. Calvacia gigantea, the top right is the purple spored puffball, Calvacia cyathiformis. Again, the gigantea. These were about 8 to 9 inches in diameter, just in lovely shape, very firm. And the smaller ones, both used to be, Lycoperdon perlatum and Lycoperdon pyriforme, now Apioperdon pyriforme. They can grow abundantly on wood or rotting wood in the forest or wood waste. When they're young and firm, they're a nice edible. They quickly start to turn yellow and bitter, so you want to cut them open before you eat them. Lycoperdon, by the way, means wolf fart, or when they're dry and they puff out the spores. So when I moved to the east and started eating fancy mushrooms like chanterelles and black trumpets, I let go of my puffballs. It was the first mushroom I ever ate. And then I tried it again. It has a lovely flavor. And if you get them young and firm, it's a nice texture as well. You treat it like you would tofu. Saute it hard, slice them and make puffball parmesan. They're quite lovely. Here's the caveat, though. Anything in the group, the species or the genus Scleroderma, the pig skin or tough skin puffballs, quickly as they begin to age, they turn firm and black, and then powdery and gray and black on the inside, and they trigger a pretty rapid onset of gastrointestinal problems. They can be, when they're very young, pure white, but they're still a problem. So in these photographs, we have two species. On the left, we have both Scleroderma citrinum and Scleroderma areolatum, probably, could be SEPA. Both of them are pretty common in our area and definitely problematic. Now, those are the foolproof. And every time I present something like this, people say, well, what about the boletes? And I'm going to suggest that the boletes, you'll learn some of them easily, but most of them are not beginners. There's a lot of boletes out there. Some of them can be easily confused and sicken people. So in this photograph here, we've got a classic. Now we're lumping them all into Boletus edulis again, which makes our lives easier. This is the king bolete. Yummy, everybody wants it. On the right-hand side is Boletus heronensis. It doesn't have a common name, but I have given it one. And I don't give things common names easily, but I call this the hurling bolete because of the gastrointestinal triggers that it causes. And we find it up in Maine and northern Maine and up into Canada even more so, growing with hemlocks. And I have dealt with a number of poisoning cases where people mistake this for the king bolete, to their dismay. There's others, someone mentioned in a comment early on, the bicolor bolete. And some of the yellow and red, yellow pored boletes that stain blue, every year or two, I deal with cases of people sickened by it. So it's one to be cautious around. Learn your boletes. I did a Beyond the Basics in boletes earlier this year, and someone emailed me before. He says, so is this going to be comprehensive? I said, no way. There's a lot of them, but so learn them. So the few others I'm going to just touch on, because people are really interested in the medicinals. I want to talk on the reishi or hemlock varnish conch or varnish conchs, and I'll talk a little bit about agaricus. So this is a medicinal mushroom. They're distinctive. They're beautiful. Here in northern New England, we mostly have them on hemlock and conifers, but we also have them occasionally, the lucidum and a few others, oregonense, that grow on deciduous hosts. It's beautiful, distinctive, and a really nice medicinal mushroom. Not edible, though some people eat it when it's just emerging from the wood. I think it's a waste, but they're gorgeous. Very distinctive and annual. And I want, depending on where you are in the country, agaricus, as we know from the recently published book that's deep and thick and long and lovely, they're complex. And we're still learning to differentiate them. So agaricus arvensis, what we call the horse mushroom here, is really, there's a few other species in that group, crocodiliensis and a couple, large 4 to 8, even 10 inches in diameter, with gray gills that then turn reddish to deep brown, and a significant membranous partial veil. A lovely mushroom. And the Agaricus campestris group, and now campestris is a European species, so we're trying to figure out what the number of species we have here are. But either way, it's a great workhorse. It's a lovely edible. Learn them. We call them the pink bottoms because the gills start out pink and then go through to deep brown. Further to the south, there's a few toxic species on the west coast. It's a common cause of gastrointestinal distress, some of the species there. So learn them. All right, so I'm going to do a couple more slides, more, for the beginner. Where do you go from here? Where do you go from here? And I want to talk a little bit about sustainable foraging. And I love this image that my son sent me. No mushroom hunting, mine, they're all mine. And that reflects so much of our attitudes when we find a great place for mushrooms. So unless you own the forest or the field, the mushrooms are not yours. Ask permission, find out who owns them. How many times have I knocked on a door and asked, and very, very few times have someone said no. Seek permission. And responsibly harvesting, don't harvest more than you're going to use. Always leave some behind to spread the spores. And then beyond that, if you're new to this, before you ever collect mushrooms, do whatever you need to do to learn them. And spend the time focusing on the edible ones as much as you focus on the toxic ones. Buy field guides, and I'll suggest some field guides at the end of this. I have tons of them. There are some really good reputable websites out there. The apps that you can get, I don't trust them as far as I can throw my cell phone. So be cautious about them. Hang out on the regional Facebook sites, particularly as a way to learn what is coming in your area. Never rely on them solely for identification. Take a class, join one of your regional clubs like you have, connect with other, geeky mushroom people to learn, attend those forays. And I always suggest find a mentor. Find somebody who lives in your area that tromps the same woods, whose knowledge base and judgment you trust. And then whatever you do, treat them so kindly that they smile when they see you coming. Ask them over to your tromping ground to say, hey, can you walk this with me and I'll cook you dinner? If they love those good, meaty, fruit-forward wines, bring those, cookies, whatever, because they can really increase your learning curve. And then once you begin to collect mushrooms, recognize all mushrooms are edible. But you get the wrong one, it's only once. Start slow. Start slow, stay safe. This should never, ever be an extreme sport. And, therefore your goal, and I'm seeing people that get really competitive about how many mushroom species they eat. And don't push your envelope. Collect only from uncontaminated ground. I avoid heavily traveled roads or railroad right-of-ways. I collect mushrooms on golf courses, but never to eat. Or that neighbor whose yard is just picture perfect and comes from much application of things. Only uncontaminated ground. And collect young, firm, prime mushrooms for food, but collect everything, all ages and all stages and all parts to make sure you can do accurate identification. Make a spore print. If you're into the reagents for color changes, do whatever you need to be sure of your ID, and don't eat it until you're sure of what it is. I have had many cases where I've collected mushrooms, fairly certain it was an edible, but put them in my compost. I don't eat them until I know I can identify them walking down the path toward them. But I've been sickened once, but only once. And then the next one is, once you start eating, if you eat a mushroom for the first time, make sure you cook it well, because some of them are toxic. And if you're eating mushrooms for the first time, don't put everything you found that day into the same saute pan. Eat only one new species at a time. Because if you've cooked up 5 or 6 and you get sick, those are 6 mushrooms you'll never eat again, because you don't know which one sickened you. And eat a small amount. Don't be a glutton, and make sure you tolerate it well. And if you're at all anxious, take good photographs, keep one aside so that they have something to show me when they call me from the poison center or whoever they call. And I have a practice. First time I eat a new mushroom, I'm the only one that eats it. I recommend that to everybody. Be your own guinea pig. And be cautious sharing it with people that have vulnerable health. They're hard to digest anyway. And I have a habit. I always tell people, if I'm feeding them mushrooms that I have foraged, I tell them what it is and where I've collected it. And some people are still very, very cautious. And there's a direct link between my anxiety and my gastrointestinal distress. So say, oh, no problem. I'll eat the rest of these. So accept that your guests may not choose to eat them. And beyond that, I'm going to go back. You want to make sure that when you're collecting them, it's as enjoyable as when you're eating the best mushrooms. So take advantage of that forest bathing, is what they call it now. So let me talk about some resources. For guides, boy, this is a moving target. And there's some, as the beginning, I have an homage to Gary Linkoff. The Complete Mushroom Hunter was a fun book to play with, covering a little bit of everything, including culture. Mushrooms of Northeastern North America, Tim Baroni out of New York. That's a useful guide. He loves the LBMs, and so there's a deep coverage of that region. Walt Sturgeon's guide from 2018 of the Appalachian mushrooms. And while I'm talking about that, I want to acknowledge, it goes way back. Bill Rudy's book, Mushrooms of West Virginia and the Appalachians. It is a lovely field guide. And even up in northern New England, it covers most of our mushrooms. Chanterelle Dreams, Amanita Night Beers, I'm going to throw that in. It's not a field guide, but it covers some of the foolproof mushrooms in some depth, as well as some of the toxic ones. Now, I'm going to ask you to put in your opinions if you've purchased and looked through the new Audubon guide to mushrooms. Michaeline and I have been talking about this a lot. I'm pretty disappointed with a lot of the choices they made, but you develop your own ideas on that. For internet, mushroomexpert.com is really useful. I love for the Northeast and use it probably more than any other website, the Myco Quebec website, which is it's all in French. So you'll have to deal with that language, but it's got a really lovely range of mushrooms and information. Chanterelle Dreams or Romp there, to give you that. It's recently, they're about to publish it in Chinese language version, which is, I think, so much fun. And just to acknowledge, and I do appreciate Susan mentioning it. Michaeline and I will be back up in Eagle Hill, I think, for our 13th go this end of July, early August. I do a number of different classes, including a weekend on Hurricane Island, which is an island off the coast of Maine, the Hurricane Island Center for Science and Leadership, which is just, it's so much fun just to be out on an island for a weekend. So connect with us and we will play. And that's my last slide. But, quoting Rumi, let the beauty you love be what you do. There truly are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the earth. And for me, for 50 years, mushrooming has been one of those. It keeps me balanced for the other work I do. So I will stop sharing. And Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you. I am happy if there are not people in the chat for people to unmute if they'd like as well. I'll leave that to you, though.
That was terrific. Thank you so much, Greg. Really informative, wonderful talk. And we have a lot of questions. The first question is from Susanna Pretzer. Susanna, do you want to unmute yourself and ask Greg your question?
Sure. I was just wondering about tips for distinguishing the bicolor bolete from red and yellow boletes. I know that you sort of briefly touched on the fact that it's more complicated, so I understand if you don't want to get into it now, but I would love to hear about it.
Yeah, I wouldn't get deeply into it. There's a couple of things that are really key. It often has an irregularly shaped cap in many of them, it has the yellow pores, which are fairly thin layer compared to other mushrooms, and they stain blue consistently, but the flesh is really inconsistent in terms of blue staining. And one thing that's always consistent with this mushroom, when the larvae of critters start tunneling through it, they stain red, and it's really clear. Beyond that, it took me probably, and these were years ago, 3-4 years before I was really comfortable and confident. So Susanna, take your time. Bring them over to a friend, bring them to my house, and bring a good sized basket of prime ones, and I'll test them to make sure and relate my wisdom to you in the process.
Unfortunately, I'm in the DC area, so that might be tough, but I've composted what might have been one just because I'm not yet confident. So, hopefully in time, I'll get that confidence. Thank you.
I have fed my compost tons of mushrooms over the years with the same reasoning.
Michael, you had a question about chanterelles. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. Quick question: are the fork gills and chanterelles an effective ID to differentiate between like false chanterelles?
Well, the Hygrophorapsis, its gills are a little bit, they're not really knife edge, but they fork multiple times. As it travels from the margin down to the stem, it may fork several times, where the chanterelle forks kind of irregularly. And it's certainly an excellent way to distinguish it from the jack-o'-lantern, which very knife edge gills that never fork.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then, Michael, you had a question about hydnums in general.
Yes, I was just curious because they're so distinctive. Is it safe? Are all hidden safe, generally speaking? And it's just a choice of picking which one you think is the best. If once I know I'm in that hidden group, do I know I'm dealing with the safe group?
Boy, as far as my experience goes, yes. I know up in if you visit the Quebec site and some of the hidden specialists, they're kind of breaking them down, particularly some of the smaller ones. But I have personally, from the literature and my experience, I've never run into people having toxicology or being sickened by the hidden group. And if there may be others on this that might have other information.
And Susanna Pretzer, you had another question about maitakes.
Yeah, I guess so. My experience has been that they get buggy as they get older. And I just wanted to check because on the slide it said, you want to harvest them when they're young. I was just wanting to check if that's just in terms of their culinary quality or if there's any like safety concerns about when they're older.
To me, it's more textural quality. Particularly as they if the pore surface is starting to turn a little bit off-white or yellowish, to me that's an indication they're over mature. And in my experience, the bugginess is entirely related to how cool or warm it is out. In a warmer fall, they may fruit and get buggy, but usually I don't have that in terms of the larvae tunneling into them. I usually don't see that much of a problem, at least not in northern New England, Susanna. Down in DC, I'm not as familiar with the experience.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is generally warmer here. So I had one time when I got one home and then just realized that the pore surface had been entirely covered in tiny little off-white bugs that I had not noticed at first. And I was like, maybe I don't want to eat that.
Extra protein, some might say, but yeah, it's a bit off-putting.
Next, Tim Ballard has a question about gear. Tim, would you like to ask Greg your question?
Hi there, Greg. This is a simple question, but I was just curious. The knife was very beautiful, so I was just kind of curious where you got that thing.
That was a gift. It was a standard open L knife, and there's a lovely micro sculptor named Jack Vessery up here in Damascata, and I did some favors for his family, and his son, who I was taking out mushrooming, his adult son, brought this knife to me, and it took my breath away. And so I call it my dress knife, and I use it for photographing. And I did a short book of photographs that I sent to Jack as a present. I'm still astounded by the beauty of that knife. And quite honestly, his usual work, look him up. This one is crude compared to what he typically does. His sculptures.
What's the name again?
Jack, Jacqueus, Vessery, Vessery.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, quite a terrific knife, I gotta say. Nancy Krikorian, you have a comment and a question.
Yeah, I was just I've been feeling really sad. I found a bunch of black trumpets under the hemlocks, mature hemlocks in our woods, but we had arborists come up and look at them. They're being attacked by these woolly adelgids that have been coming up from the south, and I'm in Columbia County, now reached there. And I'm just curious about what it means long-term for the trees, and then also for the mushrooms. I mean, it's probably going to maybe be 15 or 20 years, I guess, before the trees are gone. And I was curious, do you think that the mushrooms will still continue coming?
Well, the mushrooms are mycorrhizal on the roots, likely, of those hemlock.
Yeah.
And so, they may shift to other hosts. I find black trumpets occasionally, fruiting in a total forest of white pine. with nothing else around,
Okay.
particularly in a very wet year. Are there also oaks in those woods?
There's some oaks, but we
Nancy?
have a lot of white pine. And that's what the arborist was saying, that when the hemlocks go, the white pine will
Yeah,
take
sure.
over.
Yeah, that's a sad transition.
Oh, I know, it's super sad. Anyways, thanks.
Kayla, you had a question.
Yeah, I've been doing this for about 3 or 4 years now, so I'm learning the basics. I'm happy with that. But so far, all the people I talk to, I don't know where to find a reference where you can see the different stages of the mushroom. So all stages of an oyster, all stages of a reishi. I love that you had all the stages of the shaggy mane in one of your pictures. And I am trying so hard and not getting really many sources.
And, you know, I think that's a really a very important and relevant question. Most of the time when we do field guides, you know, the cost of the printing is kind of in direct relation to how many photographs you put in. And so with online, if you find some of the more reputable online hosting sites, they can have a range of photographs, you know, like the Myco Quebec, they're often, they use photographs from a number of people, and you can often see the range of ages and stages.
So
But
try
I agree
more
with
to
you.
search online.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
How's your French, Kayla?
No, just je m'appelle Kayla.
Yeah.
That's it.
Can I say something about the Quebec site?
Yes, David, please.
Hmm?
Yes.
There is an English version. If you, on the Quebec French site, and I think it's in the top right-hand side, you click on it, it gives you the translation immediately.
Oh.
I saw that, and what I haven't used it recently because when I used it in the past, I wasn't too pleased with the way that algorithm translated.
There's some quirks on terminology, but generally it's a superb site.
Well, I should, yeah. I'll try it again, the translation, because my French is not great, but I use it all the time, that site.
You don't need French.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Susan Bernat, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Greg. Excellent talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome,
Just
Susan.
wondering, I think I've listened to a webinar in the past where the inking with the pen, the staining of the mushroom has been mentioned, but I didn't take notes and wasn't listening carefully enough. Can you just describe that process real quick and why you do it?
I do it because it's one diagnostic feature. And what happens is when the pen, I was using the blunt end of it, it's when you rupture the cells and the contents of it become in contact with the oxygen of the air, that's what does the conversion to blue. So they call it a staining reaction. And it's just information. So some bolete species tend to blue immediately and vibrantly and go to deep blue. Others are less so. So it's just one bit of the information toward moving toward identification.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad I asked because in my mind, I was guessing that it had something to do with the difference between an edible mushroom and a toxic mushroom. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question for a beginner. Absolutely.
Diane Lucas, you have a chanterelle question.
I do. Thanks. Beginner here. I was taking notes as you were speaking. I really got myself confused here because my notes say that sometimes you can get the chanterelles mixed with the jack-o'-lanterns. And one of the reasons that might happen is because the jack-o'-lanterns grow in clusters and they sort of look like honey mushrooms to me, which I thought, oh my goodness, I mean, I feel, pretty secure with honey mushrooms, but that picture alarmed me.
Yeah, and yet, Diane, with the honey mushroom, it would never be orange, would it?
Well, not really orange, but they're slightly orange.
Yeah, maybe some of them
I'm-
kind of yellowish tan.
Yes, yeah, but not
Yeah.
orange. True.
And so when you have those questions, you say, wow, let me look at a lot of photographs or a lot of mushrooms until I feel comfortable being able to discern.
Okay, so it's really orange, not,
Oh boy, yeah, brilliant.
okay, fine. And did you say you're up in Damariscotta?
I'm north of Damariscotta. I'm in Rockland, Maine is where home is.
Okay, fine. So I want to go to your thing, Hurricane Island. We're in
Oh, good.
Harpswell over the summer, and I look forward to doing that. Thanks a lot, Greg.
You're welcome.
Okay, next, Reverend Kim D. Wilson. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask Greg your question?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm a newbie, and I guess you can go out foraging any old time, but I was wondering if there's a certain number of days after a heavy rain that you might want to go out to have the best luck.
No, that's a wonderful question, Kim. And the kind of rule that we go by is a good rain. So an inch of rain and 10 days will give you the maximum benefit from what that rain is going to produce.
Wow.
And there's a little variation. If it's been raining consistently leading up to that heavy rain, then things are going to happen quicker. If it's been really, really dry and you get one soaking downpour, it may take a little bit longer for things to really go. But in general, a week to 10 days gives it its maximum result.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And finally, Greg, Rose had asked if you could put up that final slide that had your email on it.
Why don't I'll just put it in the in the chat. If I can remember it, of course.
I can put it out to the clubs in the next announcement, by the way.
Yep, I've got it in the chat though, so.
Great, well, that is all of our questions. If someone has a last minute question or is itching to make a comment, or please feel free to do so.
Could I chime in with a question?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've ever found a Grifola frondosa growing not from the base of a tree, but from like buried wood or buried debris. Last fall up here, I found it on a hotel lawn.
Absolutely. Particularly if someone has cut down a tree and then landscaped over it, covered over, you can find it where you'd see no evidence of a tree at all. And particularly if the wood is well rotted, I've seen it fruiting from a fairly well rotted oak stump or an oak log, but typically it's on the ground around the base. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Greg. I thought it was kind of peculiar to see it just coming out of the grass in front of a hotel last year.
Yeah, well. And do you trust what has been sprayed on the grass of a hotel is always that enduring question as well.
I certainly didn't collect it for myself, but I did take some to see if any of my local gray squirrels would be into it, and they reacted pretty strongly in opposition to it.
I've never heard of the gray squirrel test, but I'll try it.
I have a couple of questions too, Greg. First of all, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but how far behind is Canada, like the northern, like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, behind Maine when it comes to mushroom foraging?
I would say that it's not very far behind because it's got, just like the coast of Maine, it's mediated by warmer ocean water. You know, in the coast of Maine where I live, we are behind, 50 miles inland because it's warmer there in the spring and cooler here. So it kind of a little bit depends on microclimate, but it would be similar, maybe a week behind.
Just
if
a week?
any. Yeah.
Okay. And the second question is how in a city, how likely is it to find mushrooms in the city with the tree, if they're mycorrhizal with trees?
I think that if the trees are, planted in those squares along a busy street, I wouldn't do it. But in parks around cities, there are many, many people that forage for mushrooms in Grand Central Park in New York City, and the old parks. And particularly, I love old graveyards because they have a diverse number, different tree species, and usually they're not micromanaged in terms of pesticides. Yeah, cities can be great places to collect mushrooms.
Okay. And do you eat mica caps?
Yes, in fact, that mushroom, if I get it young and firm, is my wife's favorite species.
Really?
I brought her some last weekend, and oh, she was so happy.
I found some last week, but I didn't know they were edible until after I left the site. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I'll just add that the New York Mycological Society has recorded over 1,500 species of fungi in the 5 boroughs. So the fungal diversity in cities, very urban settings, can be staggeringly high.
Thank you for that, Tom.
Greg, this was really fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's always fun.
Yeah, and it's just the beginning. It's really just starting to happen now. So I wish all of you happy hunting this summer. And thank you so much, Greg, and thank you all for coming.
You're certainly welcome. And thank you very much for the Myco Consortium's work over the past 3 years. It's brought us all closer together in the mushrooms. Yeah.
Thanks.